Great to see you. I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'll examine the Nanga Parbat climb, where a couple reached the summit together and then completely vanished from the mountain. One crazy decision, driven by arrogance, overruled the only thing that could have saved them, and what investigation teams believe ended up happening on the mountain is honestly one of the most brutal disappearance cases I've ever had to cover. It was June 18, 2016, and Nanga Parbat Base Camp sat in a wide glacial valley on the Diamir side of the mountain at roughly 13,400 feet. The camp was small compared to Everest or K2, just a handful of expeditions, sharing a flat stretch of moraine with views up toward one of the most dangerous peaks in the world. Nanga Parbat stood at 26,660 feet, the ninth highest mountain on Earth, and its nickname was the Killer Mountain for a reason. Its reputation had been built on decades of deadly expeditions and catastrophic weather shifts that could turn a routine descent into a survival situation without warning. The Diamir face rose above base camp in a sweep of ice and rock that looked climbable from below, but had a way of punishing anyone who underestimated the scale. Seracs hung off the upper face like frozen waves caught mid-break, and the route threaded between them on a line that changed slightly every season as the ice shifted. On the far side of the mountain, invisible from this valley, the Rupal face dropped over 15,000 vertical feet in what is one of the largest mountain faces on Earth. A wall of rock, ice, and mixed terrain so massive that climbers on the Diamir side kinda just forgot it existed at all. Very few climbers descended that way intentionally. The Rupal side was remote, difficult to access, and completely disconnected from the Diamir infrastructure. Among the climbers at base camp were Soren and Maja Lindgren. Soren was 34, a civil engineer from Gothenburg, Sweden. He was basically the kind of climber who planned every detail months in advance. Spreadsheets for gear, altitude profiles, mapped out by the day, backup plans for the backup plans. 7 years of serious mountaineering behind him, including Denali, Aconcagua, and a successful summit of Gasherbrum II the previous summer. Physically strong, technically competent, the kind of climber other teams noticed because his systems were always organized and his pace never wavered. But his weakness was something that looked like a strength on the surface. When plans failed, Soren didn't wait for help, he improvised. On Denali, he rerouted around a collapsed snow bridge that stopped 2 other teams, finding an alternate crossing that worked. On Gasherbrum II, he descended a section of broken fixed rope by down-climbing unroped rather than waiting for a repair team that would have stranded him at altitude for hours. Both times the improvisation worked. Both times it reinforced the belief that thinking on your feet was better than sitting on your hands. He carried that belief to Nanga Parbat like it was a skill instead of luck. Maja was 31, an architect from the same city. She started climbing because of Soren, but pretty quickly developed her own relationship with it that eventually matched his. Same resume, minus Gasherbrum II, replaced with a guided ascent of Cho Oyu. Physically tougher than she looked, mentally steady under pressure, and she had a way of staying calm at altitude that Soren sometimes lacked when things went sideways. But she deferred to Soren on route decisions because he had been right before, every single time. That track record built a trust between them that was completely understandable and completely dangerous, because it basically meant that when the one situation came along where Soren's instinct was wrong, she didn't have the pattern to question it. They'd been together for 8 years, married for 3. Climbing was the thing that held the center of their relationship together, the shared language they used when everything else in life got complicated. They had a system on mountains. Soren read the terrain and made the calls. Maja managed the logistics, kept track of timing and supplies, and it pretty much just worked because they trusted each other completely. Friends described them as the couple who were always planning the next expedition before the current one was finished. Nanga Parbat was the next step after Gasherbrum II, a progression toward the bigger objectives Soren had mapped out years earlier. He kept a list, 8,000ers ranked by difficulty and appeal, and Nanga Parbat sat near the top. The couple dynamic in climbing partnerships is something I've thought about a lot covering these stories. When one partner leads and the other trusts, the system works perfectly right up until the leader is wrong. And the problem is that by the time trust becomes a liability, the decision has already been made. The expedition was small, a semi-independent international group of about 8 climbers, sharing logistics, hiring local high-altitude porters, and coordinating loosely on route fixing. Not a big commercial operation, more like a collection of experienced climbers splitting at the cost of permits and base camp infrastructure, which is kinda how most Nanga Parbat expeditions worked in 2016. There were no expedition doctors, no dedicated rescue plans, no helicopter on retainer. If something went wrong above Camp 3, you were relying on the people around you and whatever you could reach by radio. The route was the Kinchover on the Diamir face, the standard line that most teams used. Like most teams on the Diamir side that season, they climbed without supplemental oxygen. Their assigned HAP for the summit push was Fazal Karim, 36, from Chilas, in Gilgit-Baltistan. 4 Nanga Parbat summits via the Diamir face. He knew the upper mountains geography, the way a local knows back roads, every serac feature, every traverse section, every point where the route got tricky and bade visibility. He had been climbing in these mountains since he was 19, starting as a low-altitude porter, hauling loads to Camp 1 and working his way up season by season until expedition leaders trusted him on summit day. He communicated through pacing and positioning more than words, the kind of guide who would just slow down when the terrain demanded respect rather than explain why. He had a wife and a 4-year-old son in Chilas. Summit bonuses funded the family through the off-season. The work was seasonal and the pay was inconsistent, but a good summit year covered most of the gaps. Fazal is the person in this story I think about the most. He knew the mountain, he knew the route, he knew something was wrong during the traverse, and he said so. And none of it mattered because the client had already decided. Fazal's private read on the Lindgrens was mixed. Strong climbers, good fitness, solid acclimatization. But Soren spent too much time studying terrain he wasn't going to climb. During the rotation to Camp 3, at roughly 23,000 feet, Soren spent over an hour photographing different faces of the upper mountain with binoculars and a camera, tracing lines on distant slopes the way an architect traces lines on paper. He zoomed in on couloirs and snow basins that had nothing to do with the Kinchover route, mapping alternate possibilities in his head the way he mapped alternate load paths in his engineering work. He mentioned to Maya that the terrain toward the Rupel side looked less steep than its reputation suggested, which Faisal overheard and filed away without comment. On a mountain like Nanga Parbat, a client who studies terrain off the road is basically a client who might try to use it. Acclimatization rotations ran through late June and into early July, cycling through camps 1, 2, and 3 on the Kinchover route. The climbing was technical in places. Mixed rock and ice with fixed ropes on the steeper sections and exposed traverses where a slip meant a very long fall. Camp 1 sat at roughly 16,700 feet on a snow platform above the initial rock bands. Camp 2 was higher at around 19,700 feet, tucked below the face's steepest section. Camp 3 perched at roughly 23,000 feet on a shelf that felt like the mountain had grudgingly allowed people to rest there. Neither Soren nor Maya struggled with any of it. Their pace was consistent, their appetite held at altitude, and they moved together with the efficiency of a team that had been roped up on dozens of climbs before this one. The summit window opened in mid-July. Forecasts showed a 36-hour break in the wind pattern, enough for a summit push if the timing was tight. 3 teams prepared to move. The Lindgrens and Fazal departed high camp around midnight on July 15th, joining a line of headlamps that stretched upward into darkness. 2 other teams departed around the same time, roughly 15 climbers in total, attempting the summit during the same window. The climbing was the standard death zone grind, steep snow and ice, each step deliberate, each breath costing more than the last. The route above Camp 3 followed a series of mixed terrain bands before opening onto the broader summit slopes, where the angle eased slightly, but the altitude crushed any sense of relief. Temperatures sat around -15 to -20 Fahrenheit before wind chill. The kind of cold that just finds you through every layer and punishes any hesitation. Soren led, Maya followed, Fazal monitored from behind. The stars were out, and the mountain was quiet in that eerie high-altitude way, where the only sounds are your own breathing and the crunch of crampons on frozen snow. Other teams were visible as headlamps above and below, small points of light moving at the pace that altitude demands. Soren and Maya Lindgren reached the summit of Nanga Parbat at approximately 10:30 a.m. on July the 15th, 2016. Their pace had slowed above 25,000 feet, but still remained within acceptable turnaround margins. Good time. The weather was holding, but cloud was building from the south, a gray wall advancing slowly across the lower valleys. By afternoon it would be on them. The summit itself was a narrow snow crest, with exposure falling away on both sides. the Diamir face dropping behind them, and the massive Rupal face falling away to the southeast, invisible under the cloud that was rolling in from below. Fazal took photographs. Soren and Maya embraced briefly, the clumsy kind of hug you get at altitude when you're wearing bulky down suits and glacier goggles and can barely feel your own arms. 15 minutes maximum, then descent. Everything was on schedule. At this point, everything was fine. Good summit time, weather holding, strong team, experienced guide. Whatever happened next didn't need to happen. And I think that's what makes this story hit different from the ones where someone pushes too hard or ignores a warning. This wasn't ego. This wasn't recklessness. This was a problem with no good answer and a solution that looked right until it wasn't. They began descending the Kinchover route, retracing their ascent path down the upper Diamir face. The cloud that had been building from the south was still below them, but rising steadily, and the temperature was already dropping as the afternoon approached. Roughly an hour below the summit, at approximately 25,500 feet, they reached a section where the fixed traverse they had used on ascent had been destroyed. A serac collapse sometime after dawn had basically obliterated roughly 200 feet of fixed rope, ripped the anchors clean out of the ice, and buried the entire section under debris that was still settling. Climbers above the section later reported hearing icefall that morning, though visibility was poor and nobody realized the traverse itself had been destroyed until they tried to descend through it. The collapse had sheared away the entire traverse line, leaving blue ice and unstable debris exposed beneath fresh snowfall, and even probing the edge triggered secondary icefall from above. Fazal radioed base camp, confirmed the collapse, asked for rope fixing team ETA. The response came back after a long pause, possibly not until the following morning given the scale of the collapse and the danger of working above fresh debris at that altitude. Other teams above the collapse were receiving the same information. Everyone was stuck, an entire night stationary at 25,500 feet. I want you to think about what that means for a second. At that altitude, your body is basically deteriorating by the hour. Every additional hour above 25,000 feet sharply increases exhaustion, dehydration, frostbite risk, and cognitive decline. And your ability to make good decisions is getting worse by the minute. Waiting was the safe call, but waiting carried its own risks. An unplanned night at 25,500 feet without bivouac gear carried enormous risk. Real quick before we continue, if you've been watching and haven't hit subscribe yet, it really does help the channel more than you'd think. Alright, back to it. Soren assessed the situation the way he always did, like a problem with a solution. He pulled out his camera and scrolled to the photographs he had taken from camp 3 weeks earlier, the ones where he had traced lines across the upper mountain. He proposed traversing laterally to bypass the collapse zone and rejoin the Kinchover route below, where the fixed ropes were still intact. Estimated as a short bypass of a few hundred meters, would slowly evolve into nearly a kilometer of lateral movement as visibility collapsed around them. The other teams stuck at the collapse chose to wait. They dug sheltered positions and settled in to conserve energy. That choice would save their lives. Fazal objected. The traverse crossed terrain he had never been on in 4 summits of this mountain. No fixed ropes, unknown snow conditions, potential crevasse fields hidden under fresh accumulation that could pretty much just swallow a person without warning. He had seen what happens when climbers leave the route on Nanga Parbat, and the outcomes were never good. He told them to wait, that the wait was survivable, even if it was miserable, and that the traverse was a gamble with no information behind it. Soren argued they could not survive an entire night at this altitude doing nothing. The cloud was building. Temperatures would drop sharply once the sun moved behind the ridge, and without shelter or sleeping bags, they would be sitting in the open at 25,500 feet while their bodies deteriorated by the hour. He had seen the photographs. He had traced the lines. He believed the bypass was manageable based on what he had studied from below. And honestly, the frustrating part is that he wasn't wrong about the waiting being dangerous. Spending the night stationary at 25,500 feet without proper bivouac gear was genuinely life-threatening. He was right about the problem. He was catastrophically wrong about the solution. Maya sided with Soren. She looked at the same photographs, heard the same logic, and came to the same conclusion. She had always sided with Soren on route decisions, because he had always been right before, and nothing about this situation felt different to her in the moment. That's the moment the wrong decision was made, and the thing that gets me is how completely rational it looked from inside. Two experienced climbers, a blocked route, a dangerous wait, and what seemed like a reasonable alternative based on terrain they had actually studied. It wasn't reckless in the way most bad mountain decisions are reckless. It was calculated. It was just calculated wrong. Fazal's options were to let his clients traverse alone or follow them into terrain he didn't know. Every instinct he had built over 4 summits told him to stay on the route and wait, but leaving 2 clients unroped on unfamiliar terrain above 25,000 feet was not something his conscience or his professional reputation would survive. He followed. For the first 30 minutes the traverse worked. They shortened the rope interval to roughly 20 feet between each climber, clipping through pickets where the snow allowed, moving one at a time across suspect sections. The terrain was steep but manageable, firm snow over ice, each step tested before weighted. Soren led, kicking step, probing with his axe, finding a rhythm that felt controlled and purposeful. He moved the way he always moved when he was confident in a decision, steady and deliberate, like the mountain owed him a path and he was just there to find it. Maya followed in his tracks exactly as she always did, each boot placement landing precisely where his had been. Fazal brought up the rear, scanning the terrain above for signs of instability. He radioed base camp and reported they were making good progress on the bypass. Base camp acknowledged. Then the cloud arrived. It didn't roll in gradually the way weather usually builds at altitude. It kinda just came up from the south and swallowed them. One minute they could see 100 feet in every direction, and then within maybe 10 minutes they were inside it completely. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 or 80 feet. Cloud flattened the terrain into featureless white, and without visible landmarks, even compass headings became difficult to reconcile against the mountain's actual shape. The Kinchover route below them disappeared entirely. The upper reaches of Nanga Parbat curve in ways that photographs from a single angle cannot convey. What looks like a straightforward west-trending slope from Camp 3 is actually a complex system of ridges, bowls, and fall lines that bend gradually toward the northwest. The mountain is not symmetrical up high. It folds and twists in ways that only become apparent when you're standing on it, and in cloud those folds are basically invisible. Each step drifted them further from where they needed to be, the slope's natural fall line pulling them around the mountain, one footstep at a time. Above 25,000 feet, the upper mountain broadens into overlapping snowfields and shallow ridgelines that become extremely difficult to distinguish in whiteout conditions, and the transition between drainage systems can become almost impossible to recognize. Basil sensed something wrong first. The snow texture changed beneath his crampons, from the firm wind-packed surface, typical of the Diamir face, to something softer and less consolidated. The wind shifted direction in a way that didn't match where they should have been, and the angle of the slope just felt different from what the Diamir face should feel like at this elevation. Steeper in some places, more rolling in others, as if the mountain's architecture had quietly changed around them while they were focused on their feet. He told Soren they had gone too far and needed to stop. Soren checked his GPS. It still showed coordinates and elevation, terrain mapping, or visible reference points. The data became harder to interpret against the mountain itself. In whiteout conditions, the position can look totally correct on the screen, while the terrain quietly pulls you somewhere the device can't warn you about. Soren checked the same bearing twice more over the next 10 minutes, repeating the same readings to Maya each time, as if confirming them would make the terrain match what he expected. Fazal noticed the repetition, the way Soren kept coming back to the same data points, like a man convincing himself rather than navigating. Hypoxic tunnel vision had set in without any of them fully recognizing it. In whiteout at that altitude, GPS coordinates without visible terrain references are basically just numbers on a screen. That gap between what the device says and what the mountain is actually doing is what erased them. They continued. The terrain began descending more steeply. Soren interpreted this as approaching the Kinchover route below the collapse, a sign that they were about to rejoin familiar ground. He told Maya they were almost through it, that the hardest part of the day was behind them. In reality, they were descending the upper reaches of the Rupel Face, one of the largest mountain faces on Earth. Over 15,000 vertical feet of mixed terrain with no established descent route and no human presence of any kind. Last radio contact with base camp came at approximately 2:15 p.m. Soren reported they could see a snow basin below them through a gap in the cloud and were descending toward what he believed was the route. His voice was calm. He sounded relieved, like the hard part was behind them, and the rest was just downhill walking. He told Base Camp he expected to reach Camp 3 within a few hours. Base Camp acknowledged and told him to check in when he arrived. Maya said something in the background that the radio didn't fully pick up. Fazal was silent. That was the last anyone heard from Soren Lindgren, Maya Lindgren, or Fazal Karim. The voice on that last radio call is the part I keep coming back to. He sounded calm, confident, like everything was working, and then nothing. Just silence on a frequency that Base Camp kept trying on scheduled checks through the evening before switching to emergency broadcasts overnight. Radio calls went unanswered through the evening. By midnight, the expedition leader had switched to emergency frequency, broadcasting on repeat into a mountain that gave nothing back. The other teams that had waited at the collapse zone remained pinned near the debris for hours before an alternate line was fixed the following day. They reported seeing the Lindgrens and Faisal begin their traverse earlier, but had lost sight of them within minutes as the cloud closed in. A 5-day search focused entirely on the Diamir face found absolutely nothing. No bodies, no gear, no tracks, no sign that 3 people and all their equipment had ever been there at all. Pakistan Army helicopters conducted limited aerial reconnaissance during short weather windows. Cloud cover and the scale of the terrain severely restricted visibility. The Rupal possibility was briefly raised on the 3rd day by a veteran HAP who had climbed both sides of the mountain, and a small reconnaissance team later approached the upper Rupal drainage from the valley side. But deteriorating weather and avalanche danger prevented any meaningful search effort above roughly 14,000 feet. Nobody knows for certain what happened after that last radio call. The working theory is that the cloud drifted them gradually northwest until they crossed onto the upper Rupal face without realizing it. Some analysts suggested they may have attempted to descend on their own. Others believe they sheltered somewhere on the upper face and never moved again. A third possibility is that they fell into one of the Rupal face's many crevasse systems. There is no way to confirm any of it. The mountain kept its answer. The following summer, a Korean expedition on the Rupal face reported finding weather-damaged fabric fragments and part of a down mitten at roughly 19,000 feet on a debris field far from any established route. They were never confirmed as belonging to the Lindgrens, but the discovery revived speculation that the 3 had crossed unknowingly onto the Rupal side, though nothing could be confirmed. No other remains were ever recovered. Soren and Maya Lindgren were never found. Fazal Karim was never found. Fazal's family in Chiles received partial compensation. His son was 4 years old. His wife later told a local reporter that Fazal had talked about stopping after one more season. There's a difference between dying on a mountain and disappearing from one. Dying means someone finds you, tells the story, brings something back to the family. Disappearing means the mountain keeps everything, and the people waiting at home never get to stop wondering. That's what happened to Soren and Maya. That's what happened to Fazal. The mountain just kept them.